Hello, hello, and welcome to week 10. This week we are going to talk about standardized work and S5 systems. So, the first chapter that you read this week is pretty focused on standardized work. I'm sure almost all of you have run into this already. Standard operating procedures. Standardized work has become very ingrained both in healthcare and outside of healthcare. So, the way your book defines standardized work is the current one best way to safely complete an activity with the proper outcome, the highest quality, using the fewest possible resources. So, your chapter really takes some time to dig into all the parts of that definition. What I want to just pull out briefly is the word current. So I think when we look at standardized work, it's very important for us to always be evaluating, is it the current best way? Has there been changes in process? Has there been technological changes? Has there been reasons to change the standardized work? Another thing to point out is that standard does not mean identical. We want standardization, but we don't want this to be so rigid that we don't allow for any flexibility. This shouldn't be inflexible, but it should be standard. So trying to walk that line between standard and identical is going to be important. And also, we want our standard work to be written by those who do the work. So when we're measuring this, when we're looking for standardization, we want to look for a couple things. One, we want to measure the process and not the person. So we've talked a little bit about Swiss cheese models of error prevention. We'll get into it a little bit more. Um, but how do we look at the process? What in the process allowed that person to make the error? Did the standard work allow for this error to occur, and how can we prevent that in the future? Rounding is also very important when we're doing this. So we want to make sure that leaders are out and watching, making sure they're watching what their employees are doing. So getting out and doing your leader rounding, especially in a healthcare setting. But even if you're not, management, those of you who've taken management classes are already well aware. Management by walking around, doing leadership rounding, all of that is very important. In my health system, we actually have official leader rounding reports that we have to do leader rounding. We have to be out of our offices and on the floors, and we have to be able to report back where we were, where we rounded, what we saw. Did we find any issues that we need to report back, positive, negative, and we have to make sure that rounding occurs. The last piece I want to talk about is checklists. So, checklists are great for standard work, and the seminal work on this topic as it relates to healthcare is the book you see on this slide, The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. So, Dr. Gawande is a surgeon, and this is not a new book. I don't have the publication date in front of me, but Dr. Gawande was the first one to really look at other industries that were high risk. So he looked at construction and he looked at aviation. And what he found in those is that there was a heavy reliance on checklists. The highest of high professional pilots who have been doing it for 30 years still did a pre flight checklist. And we weren't doing that in healthcare. So Dr. Gawande's research really led us to implement things with checklists. His first, where he really focused this, was on central lines, and he's the one who put in a central line checklist, and he saw massive improvement. So if you haven't read the Checklist Manifesto, if you're not familiar with the book, it's certainly something that I would recommend getting familiar with. One of your YouTube videos for this week is actually a nice summary of Dr. Gawande's book. So spend the I think about 7 minutes long. Spend the 7 minutes watching that video. They do a much more thorough review than I could. It's been a few years since I've read it, but really great book about healthcare quality and safety. One of the seminal works about using checklists. Dr. Gawande writes a lot of really great uh, bringing process to healthcare. So anything you get your hands on by him is fantastic. I have a couple of his books, but the Checklist Manifesto is one of the first that he put out there that made him known outside of his surgical circles. So what do we do if standard work is not complete? So these questions have to be asked. Is the standard work appropriate? So that gets right back to this question of, is it current? So did something change? Is the work still appropriate in the way that it needs to be done? Are the right tools, equipment, and materials in place and of appropriate quality? And I would also ask of quantity. We'll get into that as we get into some of our S5 and Kanban stuff in the next chapter. But did the person have what they needed? If they're trying to do a trach and they don't have access to a trach kit, and somebody had to run, and now this patient can't breathe, was it that person's fault that they did not have that trait kit, or what in the process caused the trait kit to not be available? So again, that's a process issue, not necessarily a person issue. Did the person follow the steps in sequence? So again, let's look at an emergency trach. If the trait kit was available, it was all given to them, and they used it wrong, now we can start to question some behavioral issues or how certain people perform, because the process gave them what they needed. Has the person had adequate practice in the operation? Did they know how to do what they were supposed to do? And did the system allow for the person to meet the standard? So really evaluating the work that's being done. We do a lot of this when it comes to root cause analysis. So whenever there's an error, especially human error, how did the system allow for this error to occur? One of the standardizations that's in your book is actually an airway cart, and I have an example of, I was involved in a process where we standardized an airway cart, so I just wanted to talk about that for a second. So at my hospital, we have several, and in your hospitals as well, we have many, many codes that are called overhead. So just in terms of airway, so if someone's not breathing, um, they can page anesthesia stat, which would bring an anesthesiologist to wherever the page location is. Typically, they page an anesthesia resident, and they'll be paged stat to a location, who will then try to secure the airway. On an anesthesia stat code, the anesthesia techs will also respond with a piece of equipment called a glide scope, which is a fiber optic intubation tool. There's also the rapid response team. So rapid response team is slightly below a code blue. So rapid response team would get called first, and then a code blue would call. So you typically would call anesthesia stat, rapid response team, code blue. Obviously a code blue is more than just an airway issue. So they had some thoughts that not all the equipment was getting to where it needed to go on all of these codes. And so as they really sat through it, they said, well, not every code needs a full trach kit, for example, or needs all of the airway equipment. Not every rapid response team doesn't bring that sort of heavy equipment with them. So what they did was they actually created a new code called the DART code. So they can call a DART code overhead. Everybody who's on the DART team has an emergency pager. So that pager goes off, it's paged overhead, and they call the DART code. The DART is the difficult airway response team. So this is somebody's trying to intubate a patient, and this came right out of COVID when we were doing so many intubations. And so with COVID, they'll call a DART code with or without precautions. So they'll say DART code South Wing 7 with precautions. That means it's a COVID code. And they know that not only do they need to bring all the equipment, but they need to bring the PPE, additional PPE, enhanced PPE, the N95s, all of that will come with the providers. So the DART code allowed us to create a cart. So we have our DART carts, and they are highly specialized just to difficult airways. So there's trach kits in it. There's PD trach kits in there. Any type of difficult airway equipment that you could possibly want is in this cart. The carts are standardized, and we have 4 of them. So there are 3 of them out in the house in strategic locations, and then we have 1 for trade down in materials. So they call the DART code. They will get whatever cart is closest to the area where they need to respond to. They will use that cart, and then the cart is taken down to materials management in the state that it's in, given to materials. The replacement cart is then put back in the location. So that's an example of how we did standardize our, not only our airway carts, but our even a more hyper specialized version of an airway cart. We created these DART codes in our difficult airway response teams, and it was a way to really get the right equipment to the right patients at the right time. So the next chapter that you were reading this week is about visual management, 5S, and Kanban. So visual management and 5S I'm putting together, and then we'll talk about Kanban a little specifically. So visual management, these are your tracking boards. I know those of you who work in the ED have tracking boards. Those of us who work in the operating room have tracking boards. So this is a place where I can come to my clinical hub. I can look up at that tracking board and I can say, okay, I know what patients are in what rooms. I know what patients are in pre-op. I know every patient that's in here, where they are, and what status are they in because of the codes. Some people like manual tracking boards. We have both. So in our operating room, we have 5 digital tracking boards that are huge. They're 4 feet wide by maybe 3 feet tall, and they kind of run around our clinical hub. And then we have the whiteboard. So those of you who've watched Grey's Anatomy, right, or any kind of surgical TV show, you've got the surgeon standing in front of the whiteboard. So we absolutely have one of those as well. For staffing, we find the whiteboard is just much easier to use and much more nimble than a digital solution. We have tried to replicate it digitally many, many times, and we just keep coming back to the whiteboard. And the reason why, so every one of our anesthesia providers, the surgeons, the nurses, they all have a magnet with their name on it. And then we will have the rooms come down the left. And what's nice about the whiteboard is they can take those magnets and they can move them around. So if Dr. Walsh was assigned to room 1, but now they need to move to room 2, we just move those magnets. So at any point in time, if I'm looking for a doc, I can come up, I look at that whiteboard, I know exactly where that person is. There's a parking lot for lunch and break. We know where everybody is at every time, and somebody who's managing that. We have a floor manager for anesthesia whose whole job is just to make sure people are where they're supposed to be, flow and throughput is happening. They're managing that board. The digital tracking boards are great on the patient side because they have to get checked in. And so because there's things that are happening as that patient comes through the system, we're able to track those on our digital tracking board. So I can look up and see, okay, well, room 3 was supposed to have a case that went in at 2:00. They're still on their second case and they're still in the operating room. They haven't taken the patient out. I can see that the next patient is here and they're sitting in pre-op, and I can see all of that on our digital tracking boards. So I think both have their uses. I think a lot of hospitals are doing a mixed bag. Um, the whiteboards are even, we're making a big move to having the digital tracking boards in our patients' rooms, where there's a board in there that'll tell you the name of your nurse, the name of your tech, and a lot of those are still on whiteboards in many hospitals. So even up on the inpatient units, um, the patient rooms will have a board that will say the last time they ate, are they NPO, any pertinent information that you need to know about that patient. So at shift change, if you're the new nurse, you can come in, you can check the board, and you can see exactly what needs to be done with that patient. Now, obviously, with both of these boards, the error is that somebody doesn't update the information. So with all, just as we talked about with data, when we were looking at data a couple weeks ago, it's only as good as the information. So in our operating room, our whiteboard is the Bible, and so it's always updated. I don't think we ever have an issue with it not being updated because it's used minute by minute to tell us where people are. So we always know, we know where our people are, and getting that whiteboard updated has been kind of ingrained into our staff that it has to be accurate. The next thing that your book talks about is the 5S method. So the 5S method is really how to reorganize an area. I'm sure we all have that supply closet where you kind of walk in and things fall on you. And um, this is a way to organize anything like that, to reorganize supplies, whether this is a business office, a supply cabinet in a clinical area, really anywhere. So the 5S's are to sort, to store, shine, standardize, and sustain. So sort is to remove things that are not needed. I like the example of the book where somebody went through something and found, versions of a form that had the hospital logo from the 1970s on it. Do you need that? Probably not, right? So what can you get rid of? What is not necessary? And if nobody in that area has any idea what it is, you probably don't need it. Next would be to organize it. Third is to shine it. So to keep it clean, to keep it organized, not to let it get in that state. So the shine step may be that once a week it's dusted, once a week you sweep it. And that could be something that you've put on a checklist. The fourth one would be to standardize. So what's the process to keep it organized? And Kanban comes in on that on the back end. And then sustain. What's the system for ongoing support? Because just cleaning out your supply closet every 2 years, it's probably not going to do anybody any favors when you need somebody to come in and find what it is they're looking for. Your book also gives a really nice grid on where we should store things, because I think a lot of times we just end up cramming stuff. Again, these supply closets just end up cramming stuff in supply closets. Um, we were doing a walkthrough of my unit. We're doing some major construction on our business office side, and we were walking through closets, and our VP opened one. He's like, "Oh, this must be where you store." Um, he thought it was where we stored something important, and it was where we kept the Christmas decorations. So he kind of laughed when he opened it, and like tinsel started to fall out on him. But this here gives us a nice frequency of use. So hourly should be within arm's reach, right? If you're going to use post-it notes all the time, I should have them, right? If I need a notebook in order to do my work and write notes, I should have it right here, or the textbook. If you're going to use it every shift, it should be within a short walk. So something you can get up and go get, but it probably doesn't need to be stored at the point of use if it's only used once a day. Um, or once a shift. So that's about 3 times a day. If it's daily, it can go a little bit farther away. If it's monthly, it should go into department storage and be called for. And if it's annually, it can go in hospital storage. So again, should those Christmas decorations be in the closet where we have them at the department level? Probably not. One of us could probably take that stuff home and just bring it in. Um, so I like this grid. It's worth the thought exercise of thinking through this as you're going through something that needs to be organized and cleaned up. Kanban. So the other video that I gave you this week is about a Kanban initiative in an emergency room in Canada. I like the way the guy really goes through and explains how it worked for them and how they've set it up. So typically when you think of Kanban, you're thinking of these Kanban cards. So they look um, a little bit like an index card, and they're going to tell you what the product is, where you get it from, how you order it, how much there should be, what location it goes in. So it's these little cards that tells you everything there is to know about that piece of material. So it's a physical signal, such as a paper card or a plastic bin, that indicates when it is time to order more, from whom, and in what quantity. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody come down to me and bring a piece of material, bring a line, or bring um, it was McGill forceps last time actually, and they just put one on my desk. They're like, "I need these," and I'm saying, "Well, what vendor do you use? Where do you get them? How many do you need?" Right? So just taking a disposable McGill forceps and dropping it on my desk and saying, "Get me more," isn't super helpful, right? So these Kanban cards can help with this process. So with Kanban, I'm going to actually jump down to the bottom section here first. So in a standard Kanban, this is where you'd have a 1-for-1. So if you have a supply, I'm just going to, I guess, show you everything on my desk. Say you have a ruler and you only use it every couple of days. You use one of these. It's not a high priority item. What they would do is clip or rubber band a card to this ruler. You would take that out of stock, take the card, and there's typically a bin in a centralized location where you just drop the card and say, "Okay, materials needs to bring us more." It just gets dropped in the bin. You go take your ruler or whatever it is that you're using, and you go on about your day. So as the nurse or the tech or whoever's grabbing the adhesive material, you just grab it out of supply, take that card, put it in the bin, and go on about your day. That's your standard Kanban. That's great for something that doesn't have to be where you don't need 100 of them. It's one piece, or it's something really bulky. The example they use in the video you'll watch is a central line kit. Another really common type of Kanban is a 2-bin Kanban. So for us in my world, um, laryngoscope blades and handles, we use disposables. So they use that for every general anesthetic they do, and we do 65 a day. So obviously, just putting a card on every single one of those would be ridiculous. So we have 2 bins, and each bin holds about 70 And when bin 1 is empty, the entire bin goes over to the Kanban card stack. And then materials will take that whole bin, replace it with a new bin. The other way I've seen it done, and that depends if you have how big your kind of Kanban card area is. The other way is you can just rotate it. You take that empty bin, put it on the bottom, and that's how he does it in the video. You put the empty bin on the bottom and put the full bin on the top, and the materials will just look for empty bins, grab, 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 and then they'll come back up with full ones. So you basically have 2 days supply on the shelf. Sometimes because of the timing of the reorders, you'll keep 3 days worth of supply on the shelf. If materials is only rounding once a day, then because of that timing, you typically need a 3-day supply. But if materials rounds like once a shift, you're good with 2 days. So that just depends on the rotation of your materials management. So that would be your 2 or 3 bin Kanban. The next one would be the trigger system. So trigger system would be, I don't know if I have something here that would be a good example. So trigger system would be you'd have a bunch of an item in a bin, and let's say once you get 2/3 through, there's your Kanban card, and at that point you grab that, you put it over, and then you've got your third more stock sitting in your bin. Um, it did not work for the hospital that you're going to hear about on the video, because what was happening is somebody would come and grab 5 or 6, not realizing that that Kanban card was in that stack, or they would see it and just grab behind it or grab in front of it, or it would fall down. So that one doesn't that one can be problematic, or this hospital had issues with it. I'll be honest, I've never seen a manual system with a trigger Kanban. Typically, it's either the standard or the bins. You can also have an electronic Kanban. So that's where the trigger system could work really well. So if you get very fancy, it can be weight based. So if you know how much the item weighs and you know how much it weighs full, and once it's down 2/3, it's going to electronically tell materials, hey, you need to bring up more stock. They'll do it on a weight based system. So in an electronic Kanban system, typically it's on that trigger. Once it gets down to a certain stock level, it's going to bounce back and alert materials that there needs to be a refill. So kind of going back up on the slide a little bit, standing orders and par levels. These are the two of the more common ways that we have right now in hospitals to do replenishment. So a standing order would be, it's like when you order from Amazon and you have it on auto refill, so it just shows up at your house every 3 months. I think we've all had some kind of standing order or subscription base where you end up with too much of whatever it is you're ordering. That's the issue with a standing order. So if I know that I on average do 65 intubations a day, but I don't want to run out, so I'm going to set my standing order at 70 or 75, and then I have them send me 75 a month at some, or 75 a day times whatever the order period is. At some point, I'm going to have way too much stock, and that order is going to just keep coming. And now you start to build this back stock. So that's the issue with standing orders. And it's a push system. It's not waiting. If there's issues on the point of service end, so if all of a sudden I do a ton more intubations, like a national pandemic that required a ton of people to do more intubations, I may not have enough stock. The opposite is more likely to happen, where you end up over ordering and now your stock rooms start to overflow. The next one is par levels. We've probably all dealt with a par level. So par levels are great, and they're a nice step to implementing a Kanban system. However, the downside to par levels is someone has to go around and count. So in the Kanban system, when you get to the point that you're pulling the card, you're just, that person who's already there is going to take the extra 2-3 steps and drop it in a bin. Now you've got a bin full of these cards, you know exactly what needs to be replenished. Someone for materials doesn't need to go through all the bins and count. And that's where the Kanban system can have a benefit over par level systems. So par levels are still around. They're still going to be around. Implementing a Kanban system is a big lift. They can be really, really neat for areas that can use them well. The ED and the operating room are definitely two of those areas. Any place that's heavy in supplies and materials management. So Really neat. I think they're a great materials management system, but it's typically something that's driven from your materials management department. So I'd be fascinated to hear if any of you have used a Kanban system in the past. I'll be honest, my hospital's still sitting. We have an electronic PAR system, so we have scanners. So our bins all have barcodes on them. So you take a scanner and you scan and then you enter how many you need. But it still requires somebody, usually third shift will do the reorder. So they'll look in the bin, it'll say par equals 50. They'll scan it and then they have to enter how many they want to order. So that's how our ordering system works. So my hospital is still kind of sitting on this par level. We definitely have moved away from standing orders. We do not, to the best of my knowledge, we do not use this system anywhere in our hospital. We use an electronic PAR system. So, interested to hear what you guys are doing out there. As always, please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and have fun this week. Thanks.